Hello, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're here with our Shelter in Place morning conversations. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear Swamiji, bless us with your inspiration, that we may attune ourselves to the divine consciousness and understand deep within ourselves God's will and the truth that our happiness lies in attunement with the divine, in self-offering to the light. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. I was, after finishing yesterday The Way of Ananda Sangis, which had been a series that we were doing for a while, I was trying to think what might be interesting next. And I remembered this book. It's called A Renunciate Order for the New Age. I'm not going to do a book study because the way I do book studies, we'd be at it, I hope, longer than we'll be in quarantine, but let's not have that happen. But it did occur to me that there are aspects of renunciation and aspects of the spiritual life that are related to what Swami's talking about here that I think would be very worthwhile for us to talk about. And the renunciate order itself, the Nayaswami order is what he calls it, is more relevant to everyone than most people may know. And since this time of interruption of our normal way of living is giving us at least the possibility of re-examining many of our first premises, it seemed like going into the subject of renunciation from what Swami himself calls a New Age perspective might be very helpful for us. I've called this particular talk Why Blue, because since 2009, which is now 11 years, or not quite 11 years because it was the end of 2009, I and a number of other people that you are accustomed to seeing in a public way with Ananda have been dressed all the time in blue. And Swami Kriyananda shifted from the traditional orange color of a Swami into this same blue, which is right here on the cover. Not surprisingly, we match. Okay? And many pictures of Swamiji, even some pictures that were taken when he was still in orange, people color corrected them to blue. So the answer to why blue has a lot to do with the whole question of renunciation. As it happened, because from 1987 until the end of his life, I did not live in the same community where Swami Kriyananda lived. From 1971 until 87, I lived at Ananda village where Swami Kriyananda also had his residence. His only home at that point was still at Ananda village in California. Yes, he didn't really establish a home in Italy until later. He traveled a lot, but that was where he lived. That's where I lived. And I saw him regularly when he was in town almost every day. But then after that, and for then decades after that, he would be here, there, and everywhere. By the end of his life, he was dividing his time among 3 countries: his home at Ananda village in California, his home in Assisi, Italy, and his home in India, first in Gurgaon and later in a village near Pune. But somehow or another, I had the karma, just as I describe it, I would sort of helicopter in. I would helicopter in, and I got to be part of a lot of critical moments. It was not an accident. I made a point of it when my father died around 2000 and something, early 2000s. I took part of the modest inheritance that I got from him and I put it into what I called my Swami Kriyananda travel fund, so that I would have the capacity to go wherever he was and stay for as long as it was appropriate to stay. And that was, I thank my father for that regularly. This is just an aside, but just a by the way. Um, my father, our families were not wealthy, and my father worked hard, and especially at the end of his life, he had very good financial karma and accumulated a modest amount of money. My grandfather also contributed at some point, so that I actually inherited a little bit. And all of it has been used in one way or another to serve Master's work, much of it given away to serve Master's work. The timing of my receiving the inheritance coincided with Swami starting in India, so I was able to help with that. And all the books that I've written, including this one, which was not a small thing, as you can see, to produce. All of this was my father's labor. And I just had such a sweet feeling in my heart, realizing my father was not a devotee, although he was respectful. I realized what good karma he gets, because it was his effort that resulted in many things happening that actually brought self-realization to many people. And to give my mother credit, my mother's frugal management of their finances also contributed. But there's many ways that they say that those who are close to us are blessed by our devotion to God. When we were all very young at Ananda in the 70s, and Swamiji quite strongly suggested to us, as Master had suggested to them, that we should spend Christmas in the spiritual atmosphere. He said, go to your parents for Thanksgiving if you must, but spend Christmas in the ashram, because it's a deeply spiritual holiday and should not be dissipated in the worldly way that most families celebrate, even good families. They're not spiritual in the way that we were at Ananda. And of course, many people said my parents would be very hurt if I don't come. He said their egos will be hurt, but their souls will rejoice, because your parents are blessed by your devotion to God. Your whole family is blessed. It even says actually that when one soul is liberated, 7 generations of relatives, I think it says both directions, are blessed by that, but certainly going backwards, and greatly uplifted. Isn't that interesting? And I thought of it, well, that was one of the ways. I saw it in my parents' life. I cannot tell you how, but I could feel it. But when I realized that the inheritance that he gave me, his hard work, went to bring people to God, even though that wasn't his interest, it was mine. And through me, he got that. Very, very gratifying. Now, coming back to that, because of that freedom that I had, I was able to helicopter in at all these odd moments for Swami's life. So I'm actually drawing from what's in this book now. It's the preface to this book, which I myself wrote. But there had been a prediction that Swami's birthday, that his birthday in 2009 was going to be his last birthday, that his life could end right at that time. So when it was time for his birthday, he was in India, and I flew over to spend it there, because I thought, if this is his last birthday, I would like to be there. And his health had been poor his health had been poor for years. But every time Swamiji had to make a transition from one, because he was moving every 3 or 4 months, every time there was a big event coming up, or every time he had to make a transition, moving from India to America, from America to Europe, his body was a battleground. Swami, like many great souls, he used his body to work out karma. He did, as he himself said just very directly, he did tapasya. Tapasya is a gathering of energy that can then be directed toward a goal. Now, the mechanism of it is too subtle for me to understand, but he did tapasya. He physically allowed karma to run through his body and work itself out through illnesses. Master did the same thing. At the end of Master's life, often he couldn't walk because his knees were profoundly affected, and he just said he's taking the karma of his disciples. The crucifixion of Jesus was taking on the karma of his disciples. That's why the way it's come down is that Jesus died on the cross to save us. Swamiji's makes it more subtle. He said that physical body, the physical death of that physical body, was primarily for the disciples who were with him, who were greatly elevated after Jesus' death because he drew a lot of their karma and worked it out through his crucifixion. Jesus continues to save us, but the mechanism of sacrificing that physical body is gone because the physical body is gone. But Swamiji ran a tremendous amount of karma through his body in light bearer. I mentioned this because it was a theme all the way through. When Swami was living, he wouldn't let me talk about it. I put something about this into Swami Kriyananda as we've known him, which I wrote in 2006, and he made me take it out. But after he died, he said, because it just simply wasn't the kind of thing that a person says about himself. That's how he put it. But he said it, and it was true, and he didn't dispute the truth of it. So I was able to put it into here with I felt his inward approval at that point. But whenever something big was going to happen, his body was often the battleground. And so his last birthday in India, he was scheduled to fly to Europe immediately afterward, and I was going to travel with him, and we were going to meet up with many from America in Lugano, Switzerland, before going to Assisi. But a day after his birthday, he had, no one really quite knows what it was, whether it was a mini stroke or some kind of a fit, whatever it was. He briefly lost his sight, his memory became impaired, he just suddenly became extremely weak. Common sense would say you would not travel internationally in such a condition, but his nurse Miriam, who by the way has written a book now about her experiences, which we'll have before too long, knew that usually every other time if they persevered against the obstacles, then the obstacles would dissolve because it was not a physical phenomenon. It was a war of darkness and light just being acted out in his body. So with great courage, she made the decision because Swami allowed her to, and we went and we traveled. And usually as soon as that was done, he would get better, but he didn't get better. And we stayed in Lugano, and he was ill, and I believe I write about it in that book. I was alone with him in his hotel room the night or the second night after we arrived in Switzerland, and I really thought it was possible that he was going to die. Miriam said there was any one of 3 or 4 ways he could have died at that point. His heart, his brain, I mean, there was just many different things, and it was just really clear. And Swami actually started he started running through all the different communities and reflecting on what their state was, who was in charge, how it was operating like this. And finally I said to him, "Sir, are you asking whether Ananda will continue if you die now?" He said, "Yes." But I was comforted by the fact that it seemed very unlikely that Swami was going to die at in the Hotel David in Lugano, Switzerland. It just seemed like a very unlikely spot for him to die. Now, of course, Master died in the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, so it wasn't unprecedented. It also seemed unlikely that I would be the only one there when he died. None of this made any sense to me. And so it made me feel that it wasn't going to happen, which it didn't. But he did not get better. And eventually, after he insisted on following through with all his plans, but after a week or so, he transferred down to Assisi, but he still remained unwell. And he was so unwell that even though blessedly he lived alone, blessedly for him because he loved it, he lived alone in Assisi. In India, he shared a house. And in Assisi, he lived alone, but none of us felt comfortable. Not long after this, Narayani became his constant companion, but this was just before she had taken on that role. So we all took turns so that Swamiji was never alone. Anand spent the nights with him, and various others of us spent the days with him. And I was on the afternoon shift. This is me helicoptering in for this story. And Swami just wasn't getting better. And he lay down to take a nap, and friends were coming over at 3:30, so he asked me to wake him up at 3. And reluctantly, because he was absolutely sound asleep, I roused him from his sleep, and he'd been in his pajamas, and he was behaving like such an old man. I'd had to take care of my father, so I understood this. I mean, reaching the point where just the effort to unbutton one's own shirt, to remove a pajama top, to put a shirt on, button it up again, I was doing all of that for him. So I go into his closet, and I know that he particularly likes this color. And even though orange was the color of Swami's, he only ever wore that for formal occasions. The rest of the time, almost always, he would wear blue. So I picked out what I knew was his favorite, one of his favorite silk shirts of this color blue, beautiful indigo blue color. And I put him in his shirt and helped him into the living room. But while I'm putting on the blue shirt, I'm just chattering to wake him up. And I said, Swamiji, because I knew he rarely wore orange, only formally. I said, if you just change the color of Swami's from orange to blue, you would wear it more often. And I'm just being light. Quite seriously, Swami says, I've been thinking for a long time of doing exactly that. Swamiji he would always surprise you. You would be sort of like out here doing something light, and he would be here doing something very serious. So I just listened. There was no response, except that I changed my mood to match his. So I helped him into the living room, and he sat down on the couch. I took the opportunity to make the bed, to go back into the bedroom, which was a completely separate room. I walk back into the living room. Swami is stretched out on the couch with his head on the armrest like this, his feet like this. His hands are like folded. I remember them as being folded like this, but this is really a death pose. So maybe I exaggerated that in my mind, but in one way or another, maybe more likely his hands were like this. More likely his hands were like this. Absolutely still. I thought, oh my gosh, here it is. It wasn't in the hotel room in Lugano, but on my watch. I go into the bedroom to make the bed, and he leaves the body while I'm out for just a moment. It was really, what am I going to do now? But just after a very short period of time, he sits up and he starts talking. And he starts talking about it's time to form a new renunciate order. And he said things to me which I already knew. Renunciation is not respected today. And because he spent so much time in Italy, he was very aware of this. Italy, which had always been the center of formal renunciation for the entire Catholic world, especially. Big, beautiful monasteries had just a few inhabitants. Swami writes in here, he said he has a right to speak because he's a not so healthy 83-year-old man. He said, there's just a few doddering men in their 80s in the monasteries. He said, I'm qualified to remark about this, but the young vocations are simply not coming in. Here in Palo Alto, the temple that we have used to be a Catholic church, and it was sold to us by the Catholic diocese. And we were told around the back that the reason they can't maintain the 8 parishes that Palo Alto has is because they don't have the priests, because the vocations are just not coming in. And the vocations that are coming from third world countries, Africa and South America. South America is not necessarily a third world country, but in this country and in the advancing world, that kind of formal renunciation is not popular. And Swami said even in India, he said even especially in India, it just does not have the same respect that it used to have. But this is a very serious problem, because renunciation is the heart of the spiritual path. And I don't mean living in a celibate monastery in obedience to a superior. That's an external form trying to achieve an internal goal. But the whole reality of the spiritual life is that we transcend our limited identification with the ego self and realize ourself. That's why we call it self-realization. Realize the truth of who we really are. The traditional monastic, especially as presented by the Catholic orders in the West, is this effort to suppress the ego, to transcend the ego by suppressing it. And this is what this book is a lot about. There's a lot of problems with that. And in this new age of energy, that form, like the rigidity of that form, where you leave the whole world behind and you wear a habit that's medieval in its origin, that was not let's see, so dramatically out of touch with society when it was designed, but because it's been held, it's now become a complete anachronism to the way most people dress. Um, and this separation between ordinary life and spiritual life, which was all very Kali Yuga, but now we've moved into Dwapara Yuga. So Swami's sitting up and he's saying that he feels that it's time for a new order. It's time to restore the importance of renunciation, but in a Dwapara Yuga way instead of looking back to Kali Yuga, because otherwise an absolutely fundamental principle of the spiritual path will be diluted and lost, and self-realization itself will become a third-rate power. It just won't have the energy it's supposed to have. But then what he said very simply was, this is what Satan was trying to stop by making him so unwell, and even by trying to take him out of his body. And at the time, Swami made a reference to something that had happened to him during that very short period that I was out of the room. And later he described it as, I entered into a very deep state of bliss. And I said to Divine Mother, I'll stay in my body or leave it. My life is yours, whatever you wish. And essentially she healed him in that moment. And it was a miracle healing, because he was too weak to button his own shirt. And within half an hour, he was at his computer writing this book. And that evening, he invited a whole group of people over and he told them all that he was going to do. And he said that this, he felt, in many ways might be the greatest contribution he was going to make to bringing in Dwapara Yuga and bringing in Master's work. Swamiji said many things, and Master said many things about the future of what they were doing. But it was never with bravado. It was never in order to make himself or Ananda or any of us self-important. It was always, in fact, exactly the opposite. It was based on the objective reality of what was needed at the time, where the energies were leading, and what was going to happen. I also feel that the time frame of all of this is very long. A friend of mine did a little bit of historical research, which was not hard to do. It's just not my interest. Back to the time of William the Conqueror in England, when Lanfranc, who eventually became the Archbishop of Canterbury, I believe, the leading church figure under William, and Master said that he himself was William and that Sri Yukteswar was Lanfranc. And he started the entire church at that time, which was, 1100s, was quite degenerated. And the monasteries were hotbeds of licentiousness rather than austerity. There were still pure-hearted monks and nuns, but the whole of it was beginning to collapse in a most distressing manner. And Lanfranc started at Cluny, which I believe was in France. He started a truly inspired monastery. Now, of course, he was an avatar. He was a fully God-realized master, acting in the Catholic context, because he was acting to preserve the true teachings of Christ. All of these things are very interesting and complicated. He started with 12 monks, the Cluny monks. And over the course of the next 200 years, from those 12 monks, there was an entire reformation of the Catholic monastic system. And those monks developed a new form of music. They developed new forms of liturgy. They developed new forms of art dealing with the manuscripts. They developed new church architecture. And it started with 12. But it always starts somewhere. So when you think about the life of Jesus, there were 12 disciples. He himself was crucified. And it was an ignominious ending. And some people believed that he was resurrected, but by no means all. And those disciples then tried to continue Jesus's work in the way that he was doing it, which is that it was a subset of Judaism. They just tried to, and they were completely rejected by their own people. Their own people were the mystical Jews. There was also a corrupt element of Judaism, a powerful priesthood element of Judaism, which wasn't really Judaism anymore. But there was the powerful priesthood because these things happen. So they were exiled by their own people, and there were only 12 of them. I mean, we all know what happened after that. So what looks like power to the world is often merely ephemeral power, and what doesn't look like anything to the world is often where God is planting. Planting true God realization. Now, of course, I have total faith in Master, and it's well known what my regard is for Swamiji. And my regard for him was well considered over decades. It wasn't like I just had one romantic impression and then held on to it. It was proven in the cold light of day for not quite 50 years. So when Swamiji would say something like that, and then I myself like to reason these things out. And I have been around on the spiritual path long enough to know that this understanding of how to work with the ego is really one of the most subtle and needing to be understood in the right way aspects of what you might call New Age spirituality. New Age meaning Dwapara Yuga, just moving into a new understanding. Because in rebellion against the suppression of the ego, and the more you suffer, the more spiritual you are, which has been the false understanding where the emphasis of Jesus's life is on his crucifixion, not on his resurrection. That there's been an appropriate and natural rebellion against that. God made all of creation. I'm not going to hate it. God made me the way I am. I'm going to be who I am. I'm not going to feel that I'm evil merely because I exist. And all of that is very appropriate rejection. But then we have fallen into, and the New Age teachings, that was something that I lived through that isn't so present at the moment. But a lot of it went too far, is that if it feels good, God must want me to do it. And the problem is, we're not always able to tell the difference between what feels good today and what is going to make me feel good tomorrow. Chocolate is very delicious. At least I think chocolate is very delicious. But if you eat too much of it, it won't feel so good tomorrow. I mean, that's the least and smallest example. Drinking ourselves, drinking alcohol or taking drugs to dull the pain of our emotions feels good in the moment, but it doesn't work in the long run. And many other self-aggrandizing experiences are not true to our higher nature. So it all has to be understood. And renunciation is not when we limit ourselves. What we renounce is limitation. What we're renouncing is limitation to embrace a greater reality. But it's a very deep understanding based on real experience. But if we don't keep that in the forefront of spirituality, spirituality just loses its power. Because we have to rise to the level of the divine. We can't just assume that the divine is just going to come down and hang out with us, that because I like it and I want it, God must approve. Well, he doesn't disapprove, But just like I know a 6-year-old person will say, I remember this little child saying, "Mommy, Mommy, I want cake for breakfast." And Mommy says, "Well, honey, if you have cake for breakfast, you're not going to grow up strong." And the child says, "Yes, I will." And that's a lot how we, if we don't understand, that's how we deal with God. Divine law says, if you do this, you will suffer. And I say, no, I won't. And that's my whole reasoning. Like 6 years old, no, I won't. And this has to be corrected if we're really going to grow up strong, which is, of course, what we all desire for ourselves and for each other. God bless you.